Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Amir?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So this presentation is kind of a lot of information on incident response, and I included some of a threat intelligence perspective on it so that it can be fine-tuned and made more efficient. There's a lot of information here, so we're going pretty quickly, but I'll be more than happy to take questions at the end. So here we go. Okay. Slides are moving. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is a typical IR process. This comes from the NIST definition, and these are kind of the phases of the IR process. We've got the preparation phase, the detection and analysis phase, the containment and eradication recovery phase, and the post-incident activity. And then we'll be going into sort of the details of each one of these phases, but this will give you the perspective of the activities involved in the IR process. And I'm going to mention this particular issue of digital forensics. Sometimes digital forensics is confused with incident response, but it's actually a subcategory of incident response and doesn't always need to be part of incident response, but it's, like I said, supporting role. And it's more of a technical analysis of evidence that supports the incident response process. It sometimes helps to identify the root cause, and it's used in a very detailed technical way to discover unidentified access and other malicious activities. So just a note on that. The most important part of incident response is the IR framework. A critical piece is the IR charter. That's really important to have executive support and a mission statement. The CSIRT team, and these are just in your organization, the group of people who are sort of assigned to the incident response and are able to perform activities related to incident response and to handle the incident. Also important as part of the IR framework is organizational support. So if there's legal issues and communication needs to communicate to students or other colleges or other organizations, that you have a mechanism in place to do that, a formal mechanism. And then any external entities that you deal with as part of the incident response process, such as a cyber insurance. So which we will not go into much detail here. So as part of the IR framework is the IR plan. And the IR plan is basically your plan on how typically you handle incidents. It's you want to put a high level outline of your response capability. You reference the IR charter. Again, want to emphasize the importance of management support in the IR process, because a lot of times the difficulty to properly respond to incidents because there's not enough recognized support from senior leadership. So to go into some definitions of what are incident classifications in your organization, define the people who are going to respond to incidents within your organization, a contact list so that everybody knows how to get in touch with people as incidents are handled. Internal communications plan, so when incidents do occur, how you are going to handle them, and who you're going to talk to, what's that process of communication. Training is important, so that the individuals who are handling incidents have a sort of a experience in knowing what to do and practice and performing hypothetical incident exercises is very useful when a real incident occurs. And then maintenance, make sure that the incident response plan is up to date as you change infrastructure, as you see and analyze new threats. So it's important to sort of make sure the plan is up to date. It'll make it more effective when you actually need to use it. So we'll go a little bit into what are incident classifications. The high level incidents are network intrusions, ransomware attacks, odd traffic going out of the organization. You could typically call it C2 traffic, physical compromise systems, like, yeah, so if people get hold of like, internal like systems or data or drives that aren't encrypted. Yeah, so there we go. Loss of computer system or removal of media. Unencrypted is high, and then we'll see what encrypted is later. A large spreading malware infection that's greater than 25% of hosts, targeted attacks against IT infrastructure, phishing attacks using the organization's domain and branding. So very sophisticated, highly targeted phishing attacks. Medium level, so you could say like an ongoing denial of service attack, loss of data or removal media containing well, actually, that should be encrypted. Sorry, that's a typo. So encrypted confidential information, misuse or abuse of authorized access, automated intrusion, confined malware infection, unusual system performance or behavior, installation of malicious software, suspicious changes of computer activity, be another medium thing. And then low level would be policy or procedural violations detected through compliance reviews or logs. Just maybe people like logging into the wrong system, just some systems or policy level like violations of typical IT workflows. A lost or stolen laptop with actually encrypted information, and just a small malware infection, you could consider that low level. So another part of the IR plan is the IR playbook, and the playbook is actually detailed instructions and actions performed at every step of the IR process. And so it's a clear definition with like defined steps on how to handle incidents with a degree of flexibility. Especially, it's important to have IR playbooks for anything that's considered a critical risk, like a large malware infection, stolen, unencrypted, confidential, restricted information, major system breach, a successful phishing attack against a senior executive. So you should have a playbooks for these types of critical risks that you identify as part of your preparatory process. These, as I touched on in previously, minimum playbooks: phishing, malware, ransomware, vulnerability on external facing systems, email compromise. So these are good minimum playbooks to have, well fleshed out for your organization, very specific to your systems. It'd be very, very helpful and useful when a real incident occurs. And this is just a little chart. So yeah, I won't go into this in too much detail because we don't have a lot of time. But yeah, so this is basically the workflow of the playbooks, how the playbook should be structured as part of the detection, analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, and the post-incident activity. Yeah, so these slides will be available. You can like work through it. But as you build the playbooks, you should like consult this chart and sort of bake this process into it. I'll just leave it on for a second so people take a look. All right. So testing the IR process. So exercises should include a high-level incident scenario that involves the entire team and one of the associated playbooks. So typically, as these are called tabletop exercises, and then so as you work through a tabletop exercise, you could identify gaps, corrections, or modifications that need to happen, and management should be informed of that. Should be a sort of kind of a cooperative relationship with management, so they know what's working, what's not working, what exercises worked, which ones didn't, where are the gaps. Once you sort of get all that in place, you can use sort of what we call purple team or adversary simulation, where someone comes in and creates sort of contained incidents related to your playbooks in your environment, and then you can actually have a real sort of like fire drill, try to actually work through an incident that's simulated. It's very, very good to detect to help your detections that your security systems functioning, successful functioning or efficient functioning that's in place, and also your ability to respond to incidents. It's a great way to test it in a more, once you become more advanced. And so another important thing I'd like to cover is cyber threat intelligence, right? So this is important. This will help you design the IR process, and because you'll understand more about what type of threats are out there, who the threats are to your organization, how and where the threats operate, and what the actual threats do. So this is broken down into the three types of threat intelligence: there's strategic, operational, and tactical. We'll touch on each one very briefly. Strategic is sort of understanding, like, what the threat is, who the threats are, what they're trying to do, why are they attacking you, what the goals are, and so there are certain actors out there targeting community colleges. As an organization, you should be aware of the threats and actors that are targeting you. It makes it much easier to build your IR response and your actual security systems and your whole monitoring approach and all that. So these are just some information about that. There's this if you're using a sort of a SIM or analytics tool such as Splunk or the one from Microsoft, Sentinel, you can use the sticks and taxi sort of feeds to pull in, like, threat intelligence feeds that are very targeted to your organization. That's just a URL there that if you want to do more research on that. Operational threat intelligence, would be to understand a little bit the actual tactics, techniques, and procedures that the attackers that you're targeting you would use, mapping TTPs to actionable IOCs. Basically, this is basically how the attack happens and what an attack looks like. And you can sort of, there's a nice little link to analysis of ransomware targeting healthcare, which is kind of very similar to ransomware targeting colleges. It's good to read through a few of these reports that show you exactly how the attack happens, so that you could sort of understand how you may be attacked, and you can sort of tailor your incident response to very specifically to the sort of the structure of a real known attack that's been analyzed. And these are just some like sample attack like IOCs there I just as laid out. This is the MITRE ATT&CK TTPs. This is a nice little site, which if you need to do some research on what a TTP looks like, what type of artifacts the TTP has, you can look them up, and you could put this in incident response plan, or you can also put this in your like SIM as a detection. There's a lot of things you could do with it, but this gives you to see what an actual TTP looks like, and what are its artifacts. Great site. Then the incident report. This is kind of what you'll see in an incident report, like that we just touched on previously. Like, what was done, how was this particular TTP used, what was it used for, and that this is basically goes down through all the way to the LSAS was dumped via that DLL to get access to the credentials on an endpoint. So this is just the incident reports will go through all these very specific TTPs, and you can actually get information and build your detections and your incident response around some of these things that are known to target the community colleges. And then tactical is basically sort of the long term, like getting all the information that you need to build out your IOCs and your detections. So this would be like known bad IP addresses, domain names, the hashes of these particular binaries that land on the system, specific types of file artifacts, entries and logs and stuff like that. So that would be the tactical, so that you would have the information that you need of known, bad events that you can leverage to sort of understand if something is bad is in your environment. And so this is, and then I'll go a little bit about an actual how kind of the incident response, communication flows. And just this is sort of a generic, like, organization level, like structure, but it's not necessary. So you just take it like, you could scale it down to your organization. Like if you don't have a SOC, basically you just have some people monitoring some events that you've collected in your organization, then that's your SOC basically. And then that once you detect some suspicious activity, then you basically create the incident, and then that's basically your incident response team, your CSERT team right there on the right, the people in your organization that are actually going to handle the incident. So just think of it that way. But this is basically it. You have maybe sometimes to detect in a small organization, detection is just your IT staff, might get an alert for some weird suspicious event that occurred based on some monitoring you're doing, and then you can build, you could build up the incident response plan just from this basic, outline here. So handling the incident, you're going to want to, and this is basically, already coming from your incident response plan. You want to identify scope, impact, the root cause, and you want to attribute the incident, like who actually, were the attackers or the threat. And then sometimes, this is good to know about. Some SIEM tools have this sort of, it's sort of like an application that helps you manage incidents. Sometimes there's some open source ones, some commercial ones, but it might, if you're already handling incidents and you want a little bit of an organization, like application organization around it, a way where to put your cases, your observations. You want to automate some of the processes. You might want to look at this SOAR, which is it's kind of like the industry standard for incident response and managing detections and handling suspicious activity and sort of understanding what's happening. So it's good to know about. So crisis communications. So basically, as you're handling the incident, you're going to want to do communications, right? So you're going to have issues with internal communications, external communications, and public announcements, containment strategies. You're going to want to do physical containment, network containment, perimeter containment, virtual containment, eradication and recovery. Basically, so when you're coming back from, when you're sort of handling the incident and you're eradicating the infection or the intrusion, you're going to want to make sure that you don't, like, if, like, let's say you've got a bunch of infected systems, you've cleaned them up. When you put stuff back in, you want to sort of break it up. And like look at like the timeline of your backups, if you have to restore from backup, to make sure that sometimes a malware has been in your environment for a while, and you backed up the malware, and now you restore the malware. So back into production, and you don't want to do that. So sometimes it's nice to just create subnets and then sort of build, stage the recovery, and then when you're comfortable that the recovery is clean, then you can move it to production. So just some ideas on it, on the recovery process here. So basically, part of the recovery strategy, ensure all systems are up to date with the latest patches. As you build stuff back as you're recovering systems, try to determine the root cause, and upgrade the detection rules. So once you figure out what caused this, make sure that in the future you have some detections and and update the IR processes to handle something like this. Yeah, review changes, make the infrastructure as part of the incident response, and then make sure you rescan everything before bringing it fully online. So this is the after action review. Yeah, so just some post incident activity. How was the incident detected, and was this action made in a timely manner? Were you able to sort of assign the initial severity? Did the escalation procedures work? What were your containment strategies? Were they effective? Was there sufficient evidence or time to determine the root cause of an incident? Were communication between certain elements clear, concise, and timely? So if you, after your incident, if you just go through this sort of after action review and make sure that these questions are answered and all your incident response workflow is updated, it'll just you'll just mature as an organization and in your security responses. So a little bit, we're going to go a little bit in on a little bit of a deep dive into collecting evidence here. Just what types of evidence can be collected as part of the incident response. So first is host base. So typically, if hosts are infected, you're going to want to collect, the data from the infected host, and typically that's a raw disk image, and then the system files from that system. These are kind of the these are the kind of the chunks of the computer system that you'll want to investigate as part of the data of evidence collection. There's one nice tool called CAPE, which kind of gives you the ability to collect a lot of different types of evidence. You could target like all kinds of like Windows system files, certain categories of files. Like here, this is basically for an RDP intrusion. This sort of category in CAPE will collect all the events related to RDP from an endpoint, and so this gives you able to kind of understand what a little bit of what you're looking for. This gives you a very ability to thoroughly hone in and collect very specific types of evidence from the endpoint. Open source, excellent tool, great like documentation. So it's worth learning. It's kind of like an industry standard for incident response. So network collections. So that was kind of like more the endpoint. So collecting evidence. There's firewall logs, WAF logs, web proxy logs, NetFlow. If you're able to collect NetFlow internally or in your cloud environment, that's very useful. Packet capture. That's if you're a little bit more advanced and you noticed an infection on an endpoint and you want to sort of like kind of see what the traffic looks like. You can do that. There's some tooling around that. TCP dump, Wireshark. Some people on this call might be familiar with that as well. And so a lot of this stuff also you may be collecting into a SIM already. So that's a handy way of like doing some investigations on where's the malware communicating, where are the illegitimate connections, what type of, is there data exfiltration going on? So there's a lot of good information here. This is another category of evidence collection, which is kind of becoming more state of the art now. So there are basically systems which run agents on your endpoints, and then you can use those agents to monitor and collect information. Some of them are more sophisticated than others. It all depends. Like in fact, a lot. So in the case of EDRs, typically what we see in the community college system is like Defender for Endpoint, which a lot of people here, I believe, are running already. So that gives you a lot of ability to collect evidence from the endpoint, and it may not collect everything. And then there's another very nice open source tool. So if you need a lot of evidence collection, or you really want to hone in on evidence on endpoints, it's a very easy agent to install, and it has all this stuff like I talked before, like Cape. It's all built in. It's got, I mean, it's got hundreds of like of Cape like sort of functions for collecting evidence, like a memory, endpoint data, Windows, Linux. So it's excellent data evidence collection framework. I talked about it before, but I'm thinking maybe in next few months we can maybe have a workshop on evidence collection using EDRs and Velociraptor. So I'm thinking about possibly conducting that depending on interest. So yeah, so this is how Velociraptor looks. It's basically has an agent architecture. The nice thing about Velociraptor, the agent, there's one agent. An agent is the server and the agent. So you want so you configure it as one of the endpoints as a server, and then the other endpoint as an agent, and then you just literally you could deploy it as an MSI package using group policy or an Intune, and then you basically basically go. All the endpoints will check in, and then you have full like bi-directional socket access to the endpoint, and you can like collect any type of evidence you want. Very sophisticated DNS traffic monitoring. Everything is in there. Works actually. A lot of people use it in conjunction with their EDRs, and it's a nice combo. Maybe to put on some of the more at high risk endpoints or the clients. So digital forensic artifacts allow us to uncover, discover, and recover data points that help mitigate cyber attack or risk. So we talked a little bit about that before. So we went into some tooling around sort of the forensic artifacts for more of the endpoint, sort of the static data artifacts. And this is talking a little bit more about like RAM. And so a lot of times there's in-memory malware that doesn't touch disk, that gets loaded via like so you get a phishing email, you'll click on something, and nothing will touch disk. That there will be a loader in there. It'll load the malware directly into memory, and then you won't have any file system artifacts. So you'll probably want to dump random access memory image so that you can actually see the actual processes that running in the system and what they're doing. It's a little more advanced, but it's a good, if you have the capability and capacity, it's good to have this skill set. So this is a really good tool for Windows WinPMM. This lets you very easily capture RAM images, and this works really well, even very advanced malware like kernel mode rootkits and stuff like that. So if you feel like the endpoint is compromised, good way to grab a memory image. And nice thing about, again, the Velociraptor agent, this is built into it. I'm not sure about MDE, whether it can do memory images, but yeah, but with the WinPMM Velociraptor agent, you can do that very easily. Actually, it's actually almost like a piece of cake. So we'll go that. So non-volatile data collection, some stuff, some tooling around that. Yeah, so basically, so this is more like the static data. So we got forensic images using FTK Imager. These capture more like the file system image. So the sort of the static data that's on the system, that's not in memory. Live response collection, another good set of tools to grab all kinds of data artifacts on the endpoint that are security focused. Cape, as I touched on before, is always good, and then then your EDR XDR is good to know about, depending on what capabilities in there. And that's, I said, I think something that we should sort of work on in the future is some sort of webby workshops on using the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint data collection capabilities. which I think could be useful since a lot of people are implementing that. Just a little bit more details on some of the artifacts that you could collect. There's a master file table, which contains information about file names, location sizes, and the timestamps. This is basically, you could take this and extract it. You could build a timeline of like the infection timelines and what files were added to the system over time, what files were changed over time. So this gives a nice, this is in every Windows system, and there's a tool there that lets you explore the master file table entries. Velociraptor, it's all integrated into Velociraptor as well. Velociraptor will collect all this, and I think at this point they even have like timeline plugins where you can have Velociraptor collect the master file table and actually like give you a quick graphical view of like what's there and what files. Then you can sort of analyze what files are on that system to sort of hone in on any malicious activity. Prefetch files, this is another Windows artifact. This is located under Windows Prefetch. This basically details what programs are executed on a system. Really good also to get a sort of evidence artifact of some malicious activity, malicious executable. There's a tool, PE command, that can parse these LNK files. Probably a lot of people know about these. These are basically the traditional shortcuts. When the shortcuts, an interesting thing, if people aren't aware, is that whenever you open a file in Windows, an LNK file is created, and then those are available on the operating system. So you can kind of use the LNK to see what files have been opened or executed in recently. So the LE command, another tool there that for analyzing these files. There's a lot of recent attacks use LNK files because you click on it, it opens the file. So it's very popular infection vector through malware and stuff like that. So good to know about those. Those are basically the locations of these particular file types. Jump lists. So that again, the jump lists are allows users to see lists of recently accessed items. So also again, jump lists will show you recently accessed files. Also hosts that were recently accessed by RDP. So where did this host RDP to? So very nice way to get sort of more evidence on system activity. And there's like a jump list explorer, another nice tool which lets you like just quickly scan through the jump list of that particular endpoint, and you kind of can see like get like a profile of what files were accessed and what destinations were accessed on this system. So this is another interesting thing for doing some analysis on data exfiltration. So this system resource usage monitor talks about gives you information about how much data was sent and received per application per hour. So yeah, so it's a very nice. It'll show you what processes sent and received data on this system, and like what the bulk of that is. So you could use this quickly to identify data exfiltration. Another very nice command if you suspect something like that is going on. And then again, web browsers. There's tons of information in web browsers. So basically histories, user history. This is good to sort of see if the browser was, somebody had gone to a malicious site, or was the browser taken over by some malware and used to download stuff from a malicious site. There's a database in Firefox. That's the location. So there's also a cache as well, which has a lot of information about what the browser did. So this is for reference here. So the browsers are important. I think a lot of people call browsers the new LSAS because they always go everywhere, and they always have credentials cached everywhere, right? So it might be interesting to see what credentials were cached, what type of credentials were accessed were accessed. Another way to do this is, or maybe possibly as part of incident response tabletop, to audit, you know, some of these browsers in your organization using like something like Velociraptor, which can collect all this information quickly and remotely. So very nice thing to know about. Then there's the registry, of course, which has tons of information about stuff of what's going on. There's the SAM system, the software where all the configs are stored. NT user dat, user class dat, those are map drives. So if there's if the system mapped some drives for lateral movement or to steal data for exfiltration, you could see that quickly by examining these files. Again, and also the AM cache, which lists all the executables on the system and their hashes, and then a good way to ferret out malware or malicious files on the system. And then of course Registry Explorer, so you can hunt through stuff. So here's some again a little more detail on locations of data to be used in investigations. So we got for execution, user assist. Those are GUI-based programs run by the user. Shim cache, executed programs include their pass size and last modification dates. AM cache, executed programs include their pass and all that. So all that's available in the registry right now. So you quickly can get a good picture of what's been running on that system as far as the execution portion goes, and then file access as well as there. So you got most recently used, recent files, shell bags, recent access folders, including network shares and removable devices. So all this is there. And like I said, I touched on this a few times, but this kind of brings it all together. This is a great area of the registry to quickly find some good information about what's going on the system. Windows event logs. Everybody knows the famous Windows event logs, and so these are generally collected by your SIM. Those are some good event types there that are important to understand, and as part when you're doing analysis to look for. And then again, more Windows events. These are all events that are kind of security relevant. I'm not going to read through all of it, but just you can review this presentation later. But these are critical events that you should be collecting and being able to reference in an investigation, because a lot of this is unauthorized access and malicious software and stuff will a lot of their activity will pop up in these events. Then these other logs that are important: EDR AV logs, firewall VPN logs, proxy server logs, web server logs, mail server logs, cloud and IAM logs. So these are logs that are available in your cloud infrastructure, and then your, of course, O365 logs for mail and some of the other Windows Defender and all that other stuff. And then just quickly with the last 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to go through some sample investigations here. So most typical investigations are initial access investigations. So basically like abusing RDP and phishing. So using RDP to get some illegitimate access, or phishing to get illegitimate access on some endpoint. And then phishing attacks usually involve credential harvest or malware dropper. So that's kind of those are the types of events you want to look for. as part of an incident response plan. Understanding what a credential harvest or a malware drop would look like in your environment. Yeah, so this is some of the stuff you can use as part of evidence collection for this particular um, investigation. The firewall logs, VPN logs, Windows event logs. Those can all be collected by some tools such as SOC-SIM, Cape, Velociraptor. And these are the important logs in this scenario: the system event log, security event log, and there's a terminal services local session manager log, and then the terminal services remote connection manager log. So these logs would have a lot of information on the remote service abuse. So an how to sort of analyze the RDP brute force attack. So you would search the security log for these particular events, and then you could get this. You would see some of the events that log on events there. So as part of the RDP brute force analysis, a lot of field logins definitely point to brute forcing. Yeah, you could filter successful logons on type 10. Source IP had 2 successful type 10 connections. Source IP is Russia. Login like a malicious RDP brute force. So you get a lot of field logons. Go back, I think. Go back. Yeah. So this is basically, I don't know. This has it now. So anyway, this is a typical pattern of a brute force. You'll see a lot of failed logons, then you'll see a successful logon, and then you'll see successful IP connections, and then the source IP is sometimes malicious. So this is like a pattern of a RDP brute force right here on this particular flow of patterns. So you might want to, as part of a playbook, put how do you analyze something like this. So phishing attack investigation, you take forensic image, memory dump, CAPE files, etc. You look for a process injection. So yeah, so this is the thing I didn't mention before. There's this plugin called Volatility. Well, how plug is a framework, Python framework. It's very easy to use, actually. It's actually can be this stuff also is available in Velociraptor as well. So this stuff. But you look for process injection. So Malfind will list all the processes that have injections in them. Then the command line for each process that that was used to execute the process. So sometimes malicious processes will have typical command line signatures, and then suspicious network connections. So the volatility framework has a nice set of tools around that. And then post-exploitation investigations. So this would be like analyzing endpoint. Like we talked about a lot of these tools before, but this would be a typical post-exploitation investigation here. These are some of the things you could collect: the user system cache and AM cache prefetch, which we discussed previously. Then you can see sort of get a picture of any type of malicious executables. Any of these hashes known associated with known malware. Then always there's the Defender, Windows Defender. If you have it running, a lot of times Defender won't actually like alert or block, but it will have the event for a particular execution in the log. So you can sometimes use the operational log from Windows Defender. Once you sort of detect something odd happening, you can see, did this actually get executed? Did Defender actually see the execution? So it's very, very nice way to like sort of correlate activity. Build a timeline using that tool. And then or Velociraptor, and look for files copied to other systems. And end user DAG is helpful. basically, and then did that file get copied? This is required anytime there's lateral movement, the malware has to spread. So this is a kind of a good way to sort of discover that. Data exfiltration, investigations. So Microsoft Edge history data is stored in web cache. Dat file, that's an extensible storage database. These are some things that you would want to check for during data exfiltration investigation. Check the file table for zip tools. So definitely, if you don't usually have zip tools on the endpoint, this is important to check, and especially like something like the temp folder, because if data exfiltration is going on, they're going to zip the files. The files aren't going to go out. They're going to be encrypted and or zipped. They're not going to go out in the regular size. Check software registry file for new software installs, like, for any type of, tool that file copy tool, any type of weird tooling for data movement that's not really normal to your organization. That's another quick comment I can make is the tooling. You should be very aware of what's installed on your system, and if any type of software installed that's not normal, that should definitely be of concern as part of investigation. Like, again, as we talked about, shim cache is a very good place to discover if files have been executed. And then another rclone is another piece of software that's used to exfiltrate data, and then the file table is a great place to detect to see if that file was used or stored on the system. I think that might be it. So I guess that's it. I'm kind of at the end here. So basically, that's all I have.